Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to introduce Rhiannon Barbour. And Rhiannon is a student of mine, actually, but almost finished her master's degree with us in rural planning at the University of Guelph. And she's been working full-time as a planner in New Zealand, and prior to that, worked full-time as a planner in Scotland, and did her undergraduate at UNBC in planning as well. So a great person to give us some perspectives on what it means to plan from an international perspective in different countries. And this particular module, we're looking at planning and skill sets connected to working internationally outside of Canada. So welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you with us today. So maybe just start out, tell us a little bit about your career and the fun things that you've been doing as a planner, whether it be in Scotland or New Zealand.
So I graduated from planning in my undergrad in 2015. And in my last semester, I'd done a semester abroad in Scotland. But before I graduated, I took out a 2-year working visa, like a youth mobility visa in Scotland. And when I graduated, I immediately got a job working for a local council in Scotland called Highland Council. So we served like the whole Highland region.
That's a cool area, the Highlands, isn't it? Just jump in.
Yeah, it was beautiful. Really... It was really wonderful. I was responsible for like the West Highlands and Islands area, which included like the Isle of Skye. So I got to travel around all the time for work. I was based in Inverness. So I did that for almost 2 years until my youth mobility visa ran out. And then me and my now husband that I met there moved to New Zealand because it was a place that would accept both of us. And I started working in Queenstown for a private company there, and did that for about a year, which is quite interesting. Queenstown is a very interesting place to work. It's very similar to Whistler because it relies so much on tourism and natural capital. And so then after that, I moved up to Wellington and worked a little bit for a private company and then for local government in Wellington too, because that's what I really enjoy and I wanted to get back to working for local government. So yeah, now I'm based in the Wellington region still and just finishing up my master's right now.
Brilliant. You've worked in, I think you've set a really high standard for yourself. 3 of the most beautiful places in the whole world, northern Scotland, the Highlands, and Queenstown and Wellington are just all fantastic places, aren't they?
Yeah, I'm really, really lucky to have worked where I've worked.
What did you know? Are there comparisons between working in Scotland and New Zealand that have struck you or impressed you, or key differences that you noted?
It's a bit difficult to compare the planning system. There's a lot of planners from the UK that move over to New Zealand and vice versa. There seems to be more back and forth between the 2 countries, but the planning systems are very different. So in the UK, you don't have zoning at all. The planning system is more based off of character fit, I guess. Where in New Zealand, we have a planning system that is more environmental. So environmental impact assessments are part of every planning application that somebody does, and it is quite complex and legalistic in comparison to other planning systems that I've dealt with. But it is quite interesting because you end up learning more about the whole environmental side of things, and I think being able to understand like engineer reports and things like that better than you would in other systems where you aren't necessarily, you have a professional opinion on things, but you aren't necessarily interpreting things yourself as much, which I find kind of interesting.
It's interesting you make that observation of the difference in the UK system. And I remember visiting a cousin of my wife Deb's living in Wales, again in that system, and she lived actually it was a set of farm buildings that were historical, and there was like probably a sheep shed and everything else. And this had been divided in the middle of the country, in the middle of a rural area without any village around it, had been divided to probably 8 or 10 housing units using these old farm buildings that they had converted in. And I was thinking, like, that would just not happen here. But it's a product of a different system and a different set of values and how they make things happen, which was really interesting.
Yeah, so in Highland Council, because we serve the whole Highland area, so we had the city of Inverness and then a lot of very rural areas in like hinterlands and things like that. And so like we had something called like guidance in rural housing groups. So if you already have a couple buildings, it's easy to round those buildings off with a couple more buildings and have like a little group, which I think actually works quite well in the rural environment rather than having dispersed housing throughout. And part of it is to kind of preserve the rural landscape and focus things in little nodes. And that's quite important historically in the UK as well, where like there was little hamlets all over the place, and the wider landscape was taken up by agricultural activities instead.
If we were to, and sort of moving to this latter part of our little interview, if we were to think of the skill sets that have served you well, and maybe there's skills you wish you had more experience of, or things that have served you well in both contexts, are there some things that stand out as something you would encourage our students to work towards developing their own skill set on?
Yeah, I think no matter what planning system you work in, being able to gather tons of information and balance it is, I think, one of the most important skills that planners have. So I think developing that further is really important. From like a practical perspective, if you're thinking about working overseas at all or in a different country, I would really recommend spending quite a bit of time reading up on that planning system. And maybe like going and getting like a textbook from a first year university class, for instance, to learn a little bit more about the system. I found it really good to start applying from when I'm out of country, even if I don't necessarily expect to get a job until I arrive, just so people kind of have me on their radar. And getting a visa ahead of time is really handy. So a lot of countries will have a visa process, especially for people that are under 30 or 35 to travel and work abroad. And you can get that visa before arriving, which I think is really attractive for employers to already have that all set up.
Yeah. I mean, obviously you're thrilled with the opportunity to have worked in the countries that you've worked in.
Yeah. It's been really wonderful. And I feel like I picked up a lot of skills and developed a lot of skills that I wouldn't have necessarily developed in the same way in Canada. Which is interesting. So like the UK is so focused on like character and like urban design in comparison. And then here things are so environmentally focused, which is quite interesting. It's a similar thing, but like the focus is on other aspects depending on what country you move around to. And yeah, I would just recommend if you're interested to try and apply and see what happens, because I've really enjoyed my time working in other countries.
I remember when because I had the chance to visit you in Queenston, and you were working for a consulting firm then, and just a sense of all of the things that were happening in that sector too. So any observations between private practice and working with municipalities? Because I think you've had both experiences now in New Zealand, correct?
Yeah. So I think it's like a country dependent thing, what it's like, and it depends on the type of private company that you're working for, whether it's like a planning and like urban design kind of primary company, or if it's like focused on surveying and engineering, your experience is going to be very different. And in New Zealand in particular, a lot of private companies will do work for local councils, and they'll contract even consenting work to private companies. So it is a little bit different of a balance. Where in like the UK, for instance, and in most places in Canada, you wouldn't really see that so much. So I think your experiences are very dependent on the country that you're in. But in general, I've enjoyed. I really enjoy community consultation and that side of things. And you do more of that in the public sector, and so that's kind of why I've been interested in local government work more so than private work.
Very interesting. Last little question. Have you pursued your accreditation either while you've been overseas, either in those countries or back here in Canada, just out of interest?
I'm still a candidate member. I could have gotten my full accreditation by now, but I kind of have been focused on doing the master's, and then I was working most of the time while doing it. So I haven't really had a lot of spare time to sit and write out all of my logbooks like that. Yeah. But that's the next priority as soon as I'm done this master's.
But the cool thing though is that you're practicing in Scotland and then practicing in New Zealand, and you're a candidate member, I'm assuming with I'm not sure, based out of British Columbia, probably the PIBC. So you're accumulating your experience that you can apply should you at some point be back in this country towards membership here, or likewise you could use it if you chose to become a member of NZPI, I'm assuming as well.
Yeah, so I'm an associate member of NZPI. Okay. And I've been told if I wanted to, I could, once I get full membership in Canada, they're working on an agreement right now, so I'd be able to transfer that membership. And I know at least at one point you could do that in the UK. I'm not sure if that's the case right now, and in Australia as well. You can transfer full memberships. And so you can still work on your membership in Canada while you're abroad. And that's probably the best way to go about doing things, rather than trying to, prove your membership and like your university skills somewhere else, I guess. But yeah, it's just a process.
Very interesting. One final word of questioning. Of course, when you were in Scotland, you weren't responsible for Shetland, but I have watched the Shetland TV series. So if anybody has some free time on Netflix, I don't know if you've ever watched Shetland. It's a great murder mystery kind of, I think there's 3 or 4 short seasons to it. So it's kind of a fun way to get exposure to that part of the world.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I would highly recommend it. And like the council that I worked at seemed pretty open to hiring people from overseas as long as they had visas and things like that in place. So, and I know Shetland in particular is always looking for planners. I met with the council a few times.
Well, I just want to say thanks so much. Your experience I know it will be of interest to people, and it's great for me to hear the different things that you've done as well. So thank you again, Rhiannon.
You're welcome. Glad to help out.
All the best.